Who was Charles Darwin? By Deborah Hopkinson. Illustrated by Nancy Harrison. Who was Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin took a 5-year trip around the world on a ship called the Beagle, but he liked staying home best of all. He lived in a small English village where he raised pigeons, played with his children, and pottered in his garden. Although he lived a quiet life, Charles Darwin started a revolution of thought. People have always wondered how life on Earth began. When Charles Darwin lived, most people in Europe and America believed God created the entire world in 6 days, just as it says in the Bible. But Charles Darwin was not most people. The Beagle voyage taught him to be a true scientist, to look closely at nature, question everything, and think in a new way about how life on Earth started. He showed how living things could naturally change or evolve over a long period of time. Was Charles Darwin a genius? He didn't think so. Charles thought of himself as simply a scientist. And like all good scientists, Charles was curious, so curious he was never afraid to ask hard questions, and he looked for answers based on what he saw. Charles Darwin knew his ideas would shock people. They did. Yet today scientists accept evolution as a fact. Charles Darwin is as important as ever. Charles Darwin changed history. How did he do it? Chapter 1. An ordinary boy. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury, a small village in England. His family was well off. His father was a respected, successful doctor. His mother, Susanna, was a daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, who owned a famous china factory. The Darwins lived in a large house called the Mount. It was near the River Severn. Charles loved his home. Even as a boy, he was curious about nature. He spent hours in the family garden. Once, his father asked Charles to count the peony blossoms in the garden. Chapter 1. An ordinary boy. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury, a small village in England. His family was well off. His father was a respected, successful doctor. His mother, Susanna, was a daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, who owned a famous china factory. The Darwins lived in a large house called the Mount. It was near the River Severn. Charles loved his home. Even as a boy, he was curious about nature. He spent hours in the family garden. Once, his father asked Charles to count the peony blossoms in the garden. Charles counted 384 flowers. Already Charles was learning to look carefully at nature. Charles liked climbing trees, watching birds, and taking walks. He played and fished on the banks of the river. Best of all, Charles loved collecting. He collected stones, pebbles, and bird eggs. He made sure to take only one egg from each nest. When he wasn't exploring or collecting, Charles curled up with a book. Charles's mother died in 1817 when he was only 8. His 3 older sisters and older brother stepped in to help care for Charles and his little sister, Catherine. During this time in England, many boys were sent to live at school. When Charles was 9, his father sent him to nearby Shrewsbury School. Charles hated it. He didn't like sleeping in the crowded dormitory. He wasn't good at memorizing. Whenever Charles had to learn a poem, he'd forget it 2 days later. Charles also missed home. He was very close with his older brother Erasmus. He was glad his school was only a mile away. Sometimes in the evening Charles would sneak out. Charles would race home to see his family and Spark, his dog. Then he had to run fast to get back before the school doors closed for the night. Luckily, he was a fast runner. At home, Charles and Erasmus had their own chemistry lab. The lab was in a tool shed in the garden. Charles loved doing experiments so much, his friends called him Gas. One day, Charles's teacher found out about the lab. He said Charles was wasting his time. He called the experiments useless. How wrong this teacher was. Charles's father hoped both his sons would find good, respectable professions. He wanted them to become doctors, like him. Erasmus was sent to medical school in Edinburgh, Scotland. And since Charles hated Shrewsbury School so much, Dr. Darwin let Charles go too. He hoped that Charles would make something of himself in Scotland. In 1825, at age 16, Charles began taking classes at Edinburgh University. After watching 2 operations, Charles knew medicine wasn't for him. But, partly to please his father, Charles kept going to classes. Surgery in Charles Darwin's time. I saw 2 very bad operations, one on a child, but I rushed away before they were completed. The 2 cases fairly haunted me for many a long year. Charles Darwin. In the mid-1820s, when Charles was in medical school, operations were still performed without anesthesia or painkillers. For centuries, doctors had searched to find ways to deaden the pain of surgery. They tried alcohol and substances from plants, such as opium from poppies. Sometimes they hit patients to knock them unconscious. But nothing really worked. Then in 1844, Horace Wells, an American dentist, discovered that nitrous oxide could help prevent pain when someone's tooth was pulled. And in 1846, in Boston, a patient was given sulfuric ether, a gas, during surgery. The surgeon removed a tumor from the man's jaw and the man didn't feel any pain. A new world of medicine had begun. When Charles went home for the summer, he didn't dare tell his father how he felt about medicine. Instead, he spent all his time hunting and writing. Finally, after his 2nd year of medical school, Charles confessed that he didn't want to be a doctor. His father was angry. He worried that Charles would never amount to anything. What next? Charles had to have some profession, so Dr. Darwin sent him to Cambridge University. Charles would study to be a minister in the Church of England. Being a minister was a respectable career. And since many ministers at that time studied nature, it seemed a good choice for Charles. Charles still enjoyed science and nature best of all. His favorite hobby was collecting beetles. Years later, Charles recalled a funny story about his beetles. One day he saw 2 rare beetles and grabbed one in each hand. Then he spotted a 3rd new kind. He couldn't bear to lose it. So Charles popped the one in his right hand into his mouth. Suddenly it shot out some bitter fluid. Yuck! It stung so much that Charles spit it out as fast as he could. He dropped the 3rd beetle, too. After all that, he ended up with only 1 beetle. Charles's favorite professor at Cambridge was John Stevens Henslow. Professor Henslow taught botany, the study of plants. The 2 became friends and often took walks together. This friendship would change Charles's life. Chapter 2. Chance of a Lifetime. Charles graduated from college in the summer of 1831 at age 22. He planned to return to Cambridge in the fall to do extra work, then become a minister. In the Church of England, ministers can marry and have a family. Charles would be in charge of a country church, preach sermons, and help people. In his free time, he'd be able to explore nature. In August, Charles got a letter from his friend Professor Henslow. The professor had a surprising question for him. Would Charles like to travel around the world? A captain in the British Navy named Robert Fitzroy would soon sail around the world. His ship, the HMS Beagle, would be gone for at least 2 years. There were several reasons for the trip. Great Britain wanted to do more trading with countries in South America. The captain and his crew would make maps of the ocean waters around South America so other ships would know the best routes to take. Captain Fitzroy liked science and nature. He wanted to bring along a naturalist, someone who studies nature. The naturalist would have to pay his own way. But he'd be able to collect plants and animals. Captain Fitzroy also wanted someone to talk to and share meals with on the voyage. It wasn't proper for the captain to be friends with the sailors under his command. Professor Henslow knew Charles loved nature. And Charles had a pleasant, friendly manner. He'd make a good companion for the captain on the long, lonely trip. Charles rushed to ask his father's permission. At first, Dr. Darwin didn't approve. What about the danger? What about Charles's plan to become a minister? Wasn't he ever going to settle down? It all sounded like a wild scheme. Charles's heart sank. Traveling on the Beagle seemed much more exciting than being a minister. And although sea voyages could be dangerous, Charles didn't think his father needed to worry. Luckily, Charles's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, helped persuade Dr. Darwin to say yes. Charles packed his things and said goodbye to his family. In October of 1831, he went to Plymouth, England. Circumnavigation, going around the world on a ship, was fairly common by Charles's day. 300 years had passed since Ferdinand Magellan first circled the globe in 1522. For the Beagle, however, there were many delays. First, the ship had to be repaired. Then the weather turned bad. Charles could do nothing but wait. To help pass time, he began to keep a diary. Charles decided to keep a journal of his entire voyage. At last, on December 27, 1831, the Beagle set sail. The Beagle was 90 feet and 4 inches long. 74 people lived on board, including 10 officers and 38 seamen. The boat carried drinking water and food, including about 6,000 tins of preserved meat. There were no refrigerators then. Not 1 inch of room is lost, Charles wrote. Charles had to share a small room, called a poop cabin, with 2 officers. His sleeping hammock was strung up over a table. During the day, the officers used the table to work on their maps and charts. Charles shared the same space. On his first try, Charles couldn't even climb into his hammock. It kept swinging away from him. Finally, he got in. But to stretch out his feet, he had to take out one of the drawers built into the wall. It was a tight fit. As it turned out, Charles spent a lot of time in his hammock. By the second day at sea, he got seasick. Charles suffered terribly during most of the trip. Charles once told a friend, "I hate every wave of the ocean." The Beagle's first stop was the Cape Verde Islands. These tropical islands lie north of the equator, about 500 miles off the western coast of Africa. The Beagle had been at sea for only about 2 weeks. But already Charles felt as if he'd stepped into another world. Everything was new and different. Charles saw coconut and orange trees. He walked on volcanic rocks. Right away he started collecting new insects, new flowers, and new sea creatures. Charles also became curious about how the island had been formed. Before leaving England, Captain Fitzroy had given Charles a new book called Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell, a geologist. Geologists study the history and structure of the Earth. At the time, people believed that God had created mountains, continents, and oceans in the same way God had created living things. But Lyell said something different. He proposed that the Earth had been formed over a long period of time, through natural processes, such as volcanoes and earthquakes. Charles was fascinated by Lyell's bold thinking. Now, sitting on the island beach in the hot sun, Charles had a wonderful idea. He would observe all the plants and animals and places he saw on his trip. He'd collect specimens, explore, and ask questions. Perhaps he could write a book, too. Maybe he could discover new ways to look at the world. Charles was filled with excitement. His life now had purpose. He would follow his heart and become a scientist. Chapter 3. Charles becomes a scientist. Charles had lots of time to learn to think like a scientist. The Beagle voyage was supposed to last 2 years. Instead, it lasted 5. During those years, Charles was at sea for only 18 months. The rest of the time, he explored or hunted. When Charles was on land, the Beagle would usually be sailing nearby, charting the ocean waters. In South America, Charles made 7 long trips, traveling hundreds of miles on horseback. He also made dozens of shorter trips, including hunting trips. Since he was a good shot, he often brought back fresh meat for the crew. Whenever Charles explored, he scribbled notes in a small notebook. Back on the Beagle, he used his notes to make longer entries into his diary. He also worked on his plant and animal collections. He examined small creatures under a microscope. He dried and preserved specimens. He cleaned and numbered bones. The sailors made wooden barrels, boxes, and crates for all his specimens. Charles learned from Captain Fitzroy and the other officers. He noticed how carefully they kept their logbooks. Charles tried to keep detailed records, too. This helped him become a better scientist. In any experiment, a scientist must pay attention to every detail. To catch sea creatures and tiny marine plants, Charles made his own net. He trawled it behind the ship. Charles was proud of his invention and made a sketch of it in his diary. When he wasn't too seasick, he sometimes helped catch fish for dinner. Charles made his first major discovery in September 1832, 9 months into the voyage. One day, he and Captain Fitzroy were in a small boat exploring the coast of Argentina. Charles caught sight of something that looked like a pile of bones, almost hidden by clay and soft rock. Charles wondered, could these be fossils? The next day, Charles went back with his pickaxe and dug for hours. He found fossil skeletons from at least 3 large animals. One had an enormous head. Charles had never seen any creature with big bones like these. Yet the skeletons reminded him of the smaller, live armadillos he'd seen nearby and even eaten for dinner. Did the fossils belong to a creature related to living armadillos? It was hard work to load the large fossil bones onto the Beagle. The sailors had to use pulleys and ropes. By the end, Charles was tired but pleased. He suspected that the bones belonged to creatures that had died off, or become extinct, long ago. Charles didn't know exactly how or why creatures became extinct. But these fossils held important clues. Eventually, they would help him understand how populations, or groups, of animals change over time. Fossils. A fossil is either a preserved piece or an impression of an animal or plant that died long ago. Fossils are preserved in the Earth's crust. The word fossil comes from a Latin word meaning to dig. The soft parts of dead animals rot away quickly. They don't stay preserved. Fossils usually come from the hard parts, like a tooth or bone. A fossil may also come from the imprint of a leaf or fish scales on soft material that later hardens. The science of fossils is called paleontology. By studying fossils, scientists can trace animal life back to its earliest forms. Although people had been finding fossils for a long time, when Charles lived, scientists didn't understand much about them. In 1842, a British scientist named Richard Owen invented the term dinosaur to describe unusual fossil bones that had been found. Dinosaur means terrible lizard. But it wasn't until after Charles published his theory of evolution in 1859 that scientists began to piece together the puzzle of fossils. Chapter 4. To the Galapagos. By the summer of 1834, Charles had been gone nearly 3 years. He'd explored many wild places. He'd visited Patagonia, Rio de Janeiro, Uruguay, and Buenos Aires. As the Beagle reached the southernmost tip of South America, Captain Fitzroy steered the ship carefully through the Strait of Magellan. The Beagle entered the Pacific Ocean safely and sailed up the western coast of South America. The trip had been full of adventure and danger. One time, Charles and other sailors were on Tierra del Fuego, an island near the southern tip of South America. Suddenly a huge piece of ice fell from a nearby cliff. When it hit the sea, the waves rose high. Charles thought quickly. Together, he and a sailor rushed to pull their small boat farther up the beach before it was smashed by the waves. Captain Fitzroy stopped in the town of Valparaiso, in Chile. The Beagle needed repairs. Charles was glad for some time on land. He was eager to get letters from home. Charles walked all the way to Santiago, the capital city. On the way back, he became very ill and was sick for 6 weeks. Up to this time, Charles had been a healthy young man. After this, he had stomach problems for the rest of his life. Charles longed to go home and almost sailed back to England on another ship. Soon after, for the first time in his life, Charles saw a volcano erupt. He also experienced an earthquake. He was so excited, he could barely sleep. For months, he'd been reading Lyell's book about the Earth and how Earth had been formed by natural forces. Now Charles saw this for himself. He felt the earth shake. He saw cracks open in the ground. He found bits of seashells at the top of hills. How had they gotten there? He felt sure that long ago the land had been underwater. He thought that the hills had risen up over time after volcanic eruptions. Charles was sure Lyell was right. Natural forces like volcanoes had changed Earth in the past. And the Earth was still changing. Charles climbed high into the Andes Mountains and took in everything with new, curious eyes: the shape of the rocks, the valleys below, the gravel at his feet. He tried to imagine the past, when these mountains had been pushed up from the sea by volcanic forces. On one peak, Charles stopped to look at the glorious view. The sky was an intense blue. Wild, broken rocks lay below him. Patches of snow shone from other peaks. More and more, Charles was seeing the world as a scientist. But the beauty of nature always moved him. After leaving South America, the Beagle continued westward. The next stop was the Galapagos Islands, off the coast of Ecuador. The Beagle arrived there on September 15, 1835. This was the high point for Charles. He was eager to see the amazing creatures, volcanoes, and lava fields of the Galapagos Islands. Although few people lived on these islands, for years whaling ships had stopped to hunt and fish. Sailors were fond of capturing the giant Galapagos tortoises, which were a good source of food. They could stay alive in a ship's hold for months before being eaten. Charles was fascinated by the giant tortoises. Males can weigh up to 500 pounds and measure 5 or 6 feet from head to tail. It seemed to Charles as if they were creatures from another planet. Charles set off to explore. He found strange marine iguanas, which slept on warm rocks in the sun. When they got hungry, they crawled into the ocean to feed on seaweed. Charles had never seen swimming iguanas before. He wondered how these creatures, so different from any other, had come to live here. The Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands lie in the Pacific Ocean, 600 miles west of Ecuador. They consist of 13 major islands and 6 smaller islands. The word Galapagos means tortoises in Spanish. Many species on the islands live nowhere else on Earth. About 14,000 people live in the Galapagos. Each year, thousands of tourists visit. But, unlike Charles Darwin, they can't take specimens home. The Galapagos National Park protects the islands. Charles was the first scientist to visit the Galapagos. Today, scientists at the Charles Darwin Research Station follow in his footsteps. Chapter 5. Secret Notebooks. From the Galapagos Islands, the Beagle headed west to Tahiti in the South Pacific. Then it sailed to New Zealand and Australia, and into the Indian Ocean. On the island of Mauritius, Charles had a special treat-in elephant ride. He was surprised such a large animal walked so quietly. After a stop in South Africa, the Beagle sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and headed for England. The ship docked on October 2, 1836. 3 days later, Charles was back home. He was glad to see his father and the rest of his family. He'd been away for 5 long years. The Beagle voyage had changed Charles's life. He was ready to pursue a career as a scientist. His father accepted this. There was no more talk of Charles becoming a minister. Right away Charles set to work. Soon he was meeting famous scientists like geologist Charles Lyell, whose book he'd read. Now the two became close friends. Charles also began turning his Beagle diary into a book and spent hours sorting his collections. Charles needed the help of experts to identify his finds. So he gave away many specimens to museums. The museum experts told him some of his fossils did belong to unknown animals. Then came even more astonishing news. John Gould was an ornithologist, a scientist who studies birds. Gould examined the finches Charles took from the Galapagos Islands. He looked at their feathers, the shape of their beaks, the length of their bones, and other things. He wanted to know where each finch came from. But that wasn't possible because the birds hadn't been labeled that way. Charles contacted Captain Fitzroy and other crew members who'd also collected specimens. With their help, Gould and Charles were able to identify which finches came from which islands. Then Gould told Charles something astonishing: birds on one island were not the same species as birds from another island. They were different species. Charles was amazed. He knew that in South America there was only one finch that looked like the finches in the Galapagos Islands. Charles had assumed that the South American finch and all the Galapagos Island finches belonged to the same species. But John Gould said that was wrong. So Charles came up with some ideas about what might have happened. Charles thought that perhaps some finches of the South American species had gone to the Galapagos Islands long ago. Maybe a storm had blown them there. So, at first, there'd been only one species of finch on all the different islands. Then, somehow, from a common ancestor, the finches on various islands changed over time, or evolved, into different species. If the finches had changed, thought Charles, maybe other creatures could change, too. He hadn't forgotten the giant armadillo fossils that he'd found. What is a species? A species is a group of similar plants or animals. Scientists usually identify a species in 2 ways. First, all members of the same species share similar characteristics. Second, individuals of the same species can mate with one another. For example, there are many different breeds of dogs. But all dogs belong to the same species. They share traits, or characteristics, from their common ancestors. They can mate and have puppies. A beagle and a collie will have puppies that are half beagle, half collie. An all dog. An eagle and a sparrow are different species. Although eagles and sparrows are both birds, and both can fly, there are many things about them that are different. They can't mate and have babies successfully. That's because they're different species. Every plant or animal species has 2 parts in its scientific name. The first part is the genus, a group of several similar species. The second part is the particular species. For instance, big cats belong to the group Panthera. A tiger is Panthera tigris, while a lion is Panthera leo. They are 2 different species. Some species, like zebras and giraffes, are easy to tell apart. But, just like Charles Darwin, even today scientists sometimes have a hard time telling one species from another. Charles couldn't help wondering if the armadillo fossils were related to the smaller, live armadillos he'd eaten. With his own eyes, Charles had seen that changes on Earth could take place through natural forces like volcanoes. Wasn't it possible, then, that plants and animals could also change through natural force? But what was that force, and how did it work? Charles didn't yet know. But he made up his mind to find out. And so began one of the most exciting times in Charles Darwin's life. He was on fire with questions. He poured his ideas into notebooks, which he carried everywhere. He wrote at the library, where he read book after book. He scribbled down thoughts while bumping along London streets in a carriage. Charles also talked to people who worked with animals and plants. At the time, no one really understood inheritance. That is how traits are passed from one generation to another, like brown eyes, for example. But Charles guessed inheritance might be an important part of the puzzle. So Charles asked his barber, who raised dogs, about breeding hounds with good hunting instincts. He also went to the zoo, looked at the animals, and chatted with zookeepers. Charles asked questions, listened carefully, and looked closely. Yet he never told anyone why he was so curious. Charles was leading a double life. To the outside world, he was a rising star in science. He was famous for his voyage on the Beagle and his collections. He was invited to join important groups of scientists. But secretly, Charles was trying to solve a scientific puzzle. He didn't dare tell anyone what he was working on. Almost everyone Charles knew believed God had created the world in just 6 days. The first horses and the first birds looked exactly the same at the beginning of creation as horses and birds did in Charles's time. People weren't ready to accept that the world, as they knew it, had come into being very slowly, and that it was still changing. By October of 1838, Charles had a theory to explain how creatures could change. A lot of his thinking came from reading a book about human populations. Charles realized that living creatures produce lots of offspring. Birds, for instance, have many babies. But the world isn't overrun with birds. There aren't enough resources, enough space or food for all of them. Some birds die before they can have babies of their own. Others live longer. They are better fit to survive and have babies of their own. Charles knew there are many small differences, or variations, in individual members of a species. Take the finches in the Galapagos Islands. At one time, long ago, there probably had been only one species on all the islands. Even so, not all those finches looked exactly alike. For example, some finches might have been born with slightly thicker beaks than others. On an island with lots of hard seeds to eat, it was probably easier for the finches with thicker beaks to eat seeds. Finches with longer, narrower beaks would have had a harder time picking them up. So on this island, the long-beaked birds might not have lived as long. Charles understood that a finch can't change the shape of its beak during its lifetime. But, he figured, finches with short, thick beaks that can eat more food have a good chance of surviving long enough to have babies, or offspring, of their own. Their offspring will be part of the next generation of finches. If babies in the next generation inherit thick beaks, they too will be better fit to survive and have offspring of their own. In other words, if the fit members are having the most babies, then each generation is more fit. The helpful trait, the thick beak, gets passed down, while unfit traits, for example, the long narrow beak, don't get passed down as much. So each generation is more fit to survive. In this way, over many generations, the populations of finches on the island with hard seeds are adapting to their environment. Over time, the population may change so much that it may eventually become a separate species. In the Galapagos Islands, over time, the finch population on an island with hard seeds to eat came to have thick, powerful beaks. Charles guessed that this same force could explain changes in other creatures, such as the armadillos. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he suspected that fossils could help provide important clues. Charles understood that all creatures struggle to survive. The struggle causes populations of plants, animals, and even bacteria to change. Charles called this force natural selection. Charles now had the key to part of the evolution puzzle. He had figured out something very important. But he wasn't ready to share his ideas with the world. The Regent's Park Zoo. Charles Darwin liked to visit the Regent's Park Zoo in London, where he could see a rhinoceros, an orangutan, and an elephant. The English had long been fascinated with exotic animals. King Henry I, 1100–35, kept lions and leopards given to him by foreign kings. In the 1200s, King Henry III was given 3 leopards, a white bear, and an African elephant. By 1821, the Tower Menagerie contained over 280 animals. People could pay a few pennies to see them. These animals became the core of the Regent's Park Zoo, which opened in 1828. In 1851, when the Darwins spent a week in London, they took their children to the zoo. It is still a very popular spot in London. Chapter 6. Down House. Charles was busy with his work, but he often felt lonely. Charles wanted to find someone to share his life. Of all the girls he knew, the one he liked best was his cousin, Emma Wedgwood. Emma's father was his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, who had helped convince Charles's father to let him go around the world on the Beagle. Charles asked Emma to marry him. To his delight, Emma said yes. The two were married on January 29, 1839, just before his 30th birthday. Emma was 30 also. That same year, Charles published his first book, Journal of Researches. It was based on his Beagle diary. And in December of 1839, the Darwins' first child, William, was born. Charles and Emma decided to move to the country to have more space for their growing family. They also hoped that Charles's stomach problems would improve by moving away from the noisy, dirty city. The Darwins moved to a small village called Down, 16 miles from London. They named their home Down House. Charles loved exploring the fields, just like when he was a boy. He also kept writing in his secret notebooks. By 1842, he'd begun to put his ideas about natural selection into a long paper. His first draft was 35 pages long. 2 years later, it had grown to 200 pages. He asked Emma to publish his paper if he died suddenly. He called the paper his species theory. The word theory has 2 meanings, which we can think of as little t theory and big T theory. At this point, Charles's theory was a little t theory. It was a hunch that needed to be tested. In other words, Charles's species theory was his ideas about evolution by natural selection. At this point, Charles's opinions were based on good evidence, such as the finches. But there wasn't enough evidence yet to call his ideas a big T theory. A big T theory is a group of ideas, rules, or principles that explains why or how something happens. But Charles's letter to Emma shows that he knew his ideas were very important. It also shows he was still afraid to step forward. So Charles continued to think and write in secret. He also worked on experiments and wrote other books and scientific papers. He spent 8 years studying sea creatures called barnacles. All his work helped Charles understand natural selection better. Charles and Emma were also busy with their family. The Darwins had 10 children. 3 died in childhood, including Anne, their oldest daughter, who died in 1851 when she was 10. Annie had been her father's favorite. Her death led Charles to drift away from religion. The same year Annie died, Charles met the scientist Thomas Henry Huxley, who became a close friend. His other good friends were the geologist Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, a botanist. Sometimes Charles dropped hints to them about his ideas. But he wasn't ready to show his secret paper even to them. Instead, Charles kept working to make his arguments stronger. He'd begun with scribbles in a notebook. Now he had more than 200,000 words. Would he ever be brave enough to publish his ideas? Friends and supporters of evolution. Charles belonged to a community of scholars and thinkers. Charles's closest scientist friends were Joseph Hooker, Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker, 1817–1901, a botanist who made many expeditions to study plants. T.H. Huxley. T.H. Thomas Henry Huxley, 1825–1895, a biologist known as Darwin's bulldog because he supported evolution so strongly. In 1868 he showed that birds had descended from dinosaurs. Lyell Charles. Sir Charles Lyell, 1797–1875, a Scottish geologist whose work helped explain how the Earth was formed. Chapter 7. The Origins of Life. In 1858, Charles received another letter that changed his life. The letter was from Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist living in Malaysia. With his letter, Wallace sent Charles a paper he hoped Charles might help him publish. Charles was shocked when he read Wallace's paper. Wallace had the same ideas about natural selection that he did. Charles didn't know what to do. He had poured his heart into this work for so long, but had been too afraid to step forward. Yet if he didn't publish his ideas now, someone else would get credit for a theory he discovered years before. Charles was honest, and wanted to be fair to Wallace. He told his scientist friends the truth about what he'd been working on. They came up with a plan. They would read papers by both Charles and Alfred Wallace at the same scientific meeting so both men would get credit for the discovery. The meeting took place on July 1, 1858. Joseph Hooker first read notes on evolution that Charles had written in 1844 and 1857. Then he read Wallace's paper, written in 1858. It was clear that Charles had actually come upon the discovery first. Alfred Wallace was not there at the meeting. He lived half the world away. But Charles wasn't at this important meeting either. He stayed home because one of his children had become sick and died a few days before. Charles was so sad about his son's death, he could hardly think about anything else. Although Charles didn't mind missing the meeting, he realized the time had finally come. He simply had to put all his ideas into a book. Charles worked in his study for months. He had to write down everything in longhand. There were no computers or even typewriters back then. He didn't use a desk either. He sat in a chair with a board across his knees. By the time he finished writing in May 1859, Charles was exhausted. He went off to rest for a week at Moore Park, a place like a health spa. He tried to relax by taking walks. Even on vacation, Charles couldn't help being curious about everything he saw. One day he came across a trail of red ants carrying cocoons. The ants were moving the cocoons from one nest to another. Along the way, some ants seemed to lose their way. Charles wondered why. He decided to watch one single ant to see what it did. Just then a tramp came along. Charles offered him a shilling to help. The two men squatted in the road to watch ants. A carriage drove up. The passengers stared at Charles with open mouths. They wondered about this man. He looked like a gentleman. Why was he crawling in the dirt, watching ants like a young boy? Little did they know that right before their eyes was the man whose name would soon be known throughout England, and then the world. For his part, Charles was just being a good scientist. All good scientists are as curious as kids. On November 24, 1859, Charles's book was published at last. He was 50 years old. Its title was on the origin of species by means of natural selection. Today, most people call it The Origin of Species. It is still considered one of the most important books on science ever written. Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection, was born in 1823 in Wales. One of 9 children in a poor family, he could only attend school for 6 years. But like Charles Darwin, he loved nature and collecting. Wallace decided to seek his fortune by selling plant and animal specimens to rich collectors. He was collecting in Malaysia when he wrote his paper about natural selection in 1858. Wallace returned to England in 1862, where he married and raised a family. After 1869, Wallace changed his mind about human evolution. Unlike Charles Darwin, Wallace decided human beings hadn't evolved like other animals. Wallace published more than 20 books. He died in 1913 at age 91. Chapter 8. Charles Darwin's Revolution. Charles Darwin felt sure there would be a revolution in science. He was right, and he was the one who started it. The Origin of Species threw England into an uproar. Almost everyone had something to say about it. Some people attacked Charles and his ideas. Others thought his theory had to be right, even if it turned their old beliefs upside down. "My book has stirred up the mud," Charles wrote. In June 1860, scientists gathered for a meeting in Oxford. Charles was having stomach problems and didn't attend. Perhaps it was just as well. The meeting turned into a huge argument about the origin of species. But as time passed, most scientists began to accept the ideas in Charles's book. However, Charles hadn't written much about humans in The Origin of Species. In 1869, Alfred Russel Wallace told Charles he didn't think natural selection applied to human beings. Charles disagreed. Once again, Wallace was the one who spurred Charles to act. Charles decided to write what he called his man book. This book, The Descent of Man, was published in 1871. Although the book took Charles several years to write, it was really the result of his lifetime of work. And in some ways, writing the book was the most difficult task of all. Many people still felt the only way to explain the existence of human beings was through the Bible. In the Bible, Adam and Eve are created as the first humans, looking as people do today. Charles disagreed. He said human beings were part of the animal kingdom. Humans had evolved just like other species. Many people were outraged. Charles was sometimes drawn in cartoons as a hairy monkey swinging from a tree labeled the Tree of Life. This became the symbol of evolution in people's minds. In later years, Charles suffered ill health, but he kept working. He studied orchids and insect-eating plants. He also wrote his autobiography, mostly for his grandchildren. By this time, Charles was quite famous. People wrote him letters all the time. More than 14,000 letters to or from Charles Darwin still exist. Charles spent his last years surrounded by his family. He published his last book in 1881. It was about earthworms. Perhaps this surprised some people. After all, Charles had written about the origins of all living creatures. Then he turned to something as small as worms. But that was just like Charles Darwin. He was a true scientist who observed the world carefully, asked questions constantly, and arrived at answers from what he saw. Filled with endless curiosity, he never stopped researching and experimenting. He knew it was possible to learn from even the smallest things in nature. After this book, Charles slowed down. His health grew worse. He died on April 19, 1882, at age 73, and was buried in Westminster Abbey. This is where the most important people in England are laid to rest. Today, Charles Darwin's ideas are considered a cornerstone of modern science. Darwin is just as important now as he was when he lived. And scientists have been able to fill in information for much of what he could only guess at. It's amazing that Charles Darwin got so much right. After all, he didn't have the tools scientists have today. He figured out that passing traits from one generation to another was key to understanding evolution. But he didn't know that creatures are made up of tiny building blocks called cells. Or that DNA molecules carry instructions that control everything from the shape of our eyes and the size of our feet to the color of our hair. Scientists now accept the process of evolution as a fact. Charles's hunch is now a big T theory. The evidence for evolution by natural selection is overwhelming. Even so, Darwin's ideas are still controversial. Some people will not accept them. Charles himself never tired of learning, asking questions, and looking at the world with an open mind. He was never afraid to ask, how? Or why? Perhaps most importantly, he had a deep love of nature. At the end of The Origin of Species, his love of the natural world shines through. Charles asks his readers to think how wonderful it is just to walk along a stream, listening to birds and watching insects. All these endlessly beautiful forms of life, Charles Darwin wrote, evolved from the simplest beginnings. Could anything be more wonderful? Charles Robert Darwin. February 12, 1809. April 19, 1882.